afternoon and welcome to today's webcast on the art and science of stormwater retrofitting. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Office of Wastewater Management. I'm John Costco with Tetra Tech and I will moderate today's session. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in a few moments. While we wait for others to join in, I would like to cover a few basic housekeeping items. The material in this webcast has been reviewed by EPA for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers and speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the EPA. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean that EPA endorses them. For those of you new to EPA's stormwater webcasts, I want to briefly summarize some of the webcast features. First, if you have any technical difficulties, you can call 800-833-2812 or click on the help button to receive technical support. You may also use the Ask a Question area to post any technical issues you're experiencing. Please include a telephone number where you can be reached and we will help you troubleshoot your problem. Again, that telephone number for help, technical help, is 800-833-2812. We will have several question and answer sessions during the webcast. To ask a question, simply type your question in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click on the Submit Question button. You don't have to wait until the question and answer period to submit your questions. In fact, we encourage you to submit your questions early. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. However, due to the high number of participants, all questions will not be answered. Today's speaker contact information is provided on your screen should you have any questions following the webcast. There will also be several occasions where presenters will ask you questions. The presenter will post questions in the slide window. Please submit your answers in that same slide window by clicking the radio button, not in the Ask a Question box. If you'd like to see closed captioning, click on the closed captioning button on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And at the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey. This survey will appear in a pop-up window, so please turn off your pop-up blocker at this time. We're now offering the ability to receive certificates for those who view the live webcast. In order to receive a certificate, you need to click on the Download Certificate button to view and print the certificate. For sites with more than one participant, the last slide will have a blank certificate form where you can fill in each person's name at your site. You must print this certificate after a webcast. It will not be mailed to you. As a reminder, this webcast will be archived indefinitely so you can access it after today's live presentation. The archive webcast will be posted within a couple weeks on the same EPA website. Now we're ready to kick off today's session. Today's speakers are Mike Novotney and Deb Caraco with the Center for Watershed Protection and Dan Frisbee with the City of Charlottesville, Virginia. We're also joined on this stormwater webcast, as always, by our good friend Nikos Singelis. Nikos is a senior program analyst with EPA's Stormwater Program. He's been with EPA's Stormwater Program for the last 7 years and works on many projects aimed at helping Phase 2 communities implement this challenging program. He co-authored EPA's guidance on developing your stormwater pollution prevention plan, a guide for construction sites, led the development of EPA's urban BMP tool, and is a speaker across the country on various stormwater topics. Mike Novotney is a water resources engineer at the Center for Watershed Protection. His responsibilities include project management, watershed planning and assessment, technical writing and analysis, and training and education. Mike was one of the co-authors of the Urban Stormwater Retrofit Practices Manual, which will be a focus of today's discussion. Prior to joining the center, Mike worked as a consulting engineer in northeastern Illinois, where he planned and designed stormwater management practices. Mike holds a BS and MS in civil engineering. Deb Caraco is a senior water resources engineer also at the center. She recently rejoined the center after having left to move to New York State in 2004, where she worked for the New York State Soil and Water Conservation Committee and a private engineering firm. Her areas of expertise include stormwater design, illicit discharge detection and elimination, pollutant load analysis, and stormwater program development. Deb holds a BS and MS in biological and environmental engineering. Finally, Dan Frisbee is Environmental Stormwater Program Coordinator for the City of Charlottesville, Virginia. He has worked in the city's Environmental Administration Division of the Public Works Department for the last 4.5 years. His responsibilities with the city include coordinating key elements of the city's stormwater management program and MS4 Phase 2 stormwater discharge permit, assisting in development and implementation of the city's environmental management system, as well as performing staff training, maintenance, and analysis of GIS data, and public education. Dan holds a BS in geography. Now I'll turn it over to Nikos, who will talk about the topics we'll discuss for today's webcast.
Thank you, John. This is Nikos Singelis with EPA's Office of Water, and I want to welcome my fellow speakers here today to this webcast. We have a very big audience online with us today, including I want to welcome specifically folks in Beaufort County, South Carolina, where I understand they have this webcast playing in the county council chambers and who knows where else, but they have a big crowd down there. So welcome, Beaufort County, and also welcome to the many other locations around the country that have joined us. Later on this webcast, we'll give you a tally of how many people are actually online. We had something like 1,300 computers register for this webcast, so that should translate into one of our biggest audiences yet. So to get into today's webcast, I'm going to be talking about the very important topic of retrofits, which fits in with the Stormwater Phase 2 program under the heading of post-construction. And in a minute, we'll explain a little bit more about how that fits in. But as you'll see as we go through this webcast, retrofits really are going to be an essential strategy that all of us are going to need to undertake at one level or another if we're going to achieve our water quality goals. EPA gave a grant to the Center for Watershed Protection a couple of years ago, and those who have attended other webcasts know about our ongoing relationship with the center and the excellent products that they provide. But they've been working on this retrofit manual for stormwater practices for the last couple of years. And it came out a couple months ago. You probably saw an announcement on NPDS News about it. And so today we wanted to feature that. So we're going to go through some of the basics about what retrofits are so that everybody's on the same page and how they fit into the NPDS stormwater program. We're going to be talking about the whole planning process because like any other part of the stormwater program, we want to make sure that communities are really planning and targeting their efforts to get the most bang for their buck, if you will, the most sort of cost-effective and water quality effective actions on the field. So we're going to talk about that whole planning process. We're going to talk about identifying potential locations where you can retrofit and also practices that might fit into those various locations. We're going to be talking about how to actually go out into the field and assess different sites so that you can evaluate them, and also touch on design, construction, and maintenance of practices. And then we're going to try something a little different. We have Dan Frisbee from the Center from the city of Charlottesville, Virginia, with us today. And we usually do have a case study, and those of you who have attended before usually know that the case study comes at the end. Well, today we're going to try something a little different because we actually have Dan in the room with us today, and so we're going to intersperse information from how Charlotte actually took some of these ideas and implemented them in the field as we work our way through this. So we'll be hearing from Dan on and off as we go through. So a couple things just to get started here. On this next slide here, you're seeing the cover for the manual. It is available at the Center for Watershed Protection's website. It's also available on the NPDS website, so you can get it either way. And it really is, like any good Center for Watershed Protection manual, the soup to nuts guide. Of course, it's very thick, and you don't want to actually try to read this all in one sitting because you'll probably fall asleep by about page 2. But you do want to take a look and skim around and jump around, and that's what we're going to do today is pick and choose different sections from different places within this manual to highlight for you. But it is a really, really good reference material. A couple things to point out, too. It does have some information about pollutant removal performance for different kinds of BMPs, and also some very interesting cost information on how much, particularly I found very interesting, how much different BMPs cost on a per-acre basis so that you can make some comparisons about your costs and benefits of tackling different projects. So there's a lot to this manual, and we'll be going through and highlighting some of that for you today. But again, you can download it from either of the websites. So one thing before we really launch into this, I just wanted to explain a little bit more in detail how we see this idea of retrofitting fitting into the post-construction requirement in the Phase 2 stormwater program. As you know, the Phase 2 program requires MS4s to address stormwater controls on new development and redevelopment, any project that would impact an acre or more of land. And so on the left you see new development, redevelopment, and then existing development. So the regulatory requirements span those first two areas of new development and redevelopment. And of course, as you know, there is no regulatory requirement for existing development. And the way we in the center look at retrofits, and this is somewhat of a definitional issue, but we see retrofits spanning both the regulatory side and, if you will, the voluntary side. So retrofits, when we're talking about it today, will be useful in redevelopment situations, which come under the heading of the regulatory program, but will also be useful in existing development. And one of the keys that I think that we all need to look at when we're planning for what we're going to do in an individual MS4 is to really look at sort of what the situations are. Do we have a lot of growth going on? Is it an environment that's already built out? What are the water quality issues? Where are the areas of impervious surface within the watershed? What kind of stormwater controls do we or don't we already have? And then we want to make some strategic decisions, and we'll be talking about this in more detail, about where we target our efforts. And probably in a lot of cases, in order to really make water quality changes happen, we are going to have to do some combination of addressing new development, redevelopment, and existing development. And so you MS4 should be taking credit, while technically not required on existing development. In your annual reports, you should be taking credit for your work on existing lands in your annual reports to your permitting authorities. So hopefully that explains what we're talking about. So again, we are spanning this area between the regulatory requirements and the voluntary, if you will. So next we're going to get into some of the details here. And maybe, Mike, since you were one of the authors on this great and large manual, you can tell us a little bit about sort of what's in it and how we're going to go through this. And particularly, I guess, let's define what retrofits are first.
Sure, I think that's a great place to start. And before we do define, I wanted to give a shout-out to a few of the other authors, and particularly Tom Schuler, who was the primary author on the manual, as well as Dave Hirschman from the Center, Jennifer Zielinski, who used to be with the Center, and Sally Hoyt, who also used to be at the Center, but all put in some great work on this manual. As Nikos I think he gave a really good introduction to the manual itself and sort of the bulk of the contents that are in there. I think it's important to set the stage for our presentation today by talking about what exactly is a stormwater retrofit. And up on your screen, you'll see a pretty simple definition of stormwater retrofit, and that is a stormwater management practice in a location where stormwater controls either did not exist or were ineffective.
And Mike, we should probably add there, too, that especially what we're talking about is when a city has a conveyance structure, we're saying that's not a stormwater control.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So many cities have conveyance structures that are channeling stormwater straight to the streams without any kind of intervening BMPs, and that's the situation that we're talking about here.
That's right. So these controls that we would be talking about would address water quality, channel protection, flood control. Our stormwater conveyance systems aren't typically going to do that. So we talked about the definition of a retrofit, and sort of the key question is, well, why retrofit in the first place? And Nikos gave a good introduction to why to undertake retrofitting, to address redevelopment and existing development. But, to get a little bit larger scale than that and maybe a little higher altitude, retrofitting is undertaken simply to address those situations where we have ineffective stormwater controls or stormwater controls that don't do everything that we want to do. They're not treating water quality. They're not providing channel protection. The great thing about retrofits is that they can address those problems that are caused by having that ineffective stormwater infrastructure. And they can help restore and address a lot of those situations, a lot of those problems that have occurred because we don't have that infrastructure. And we'll talk about a couple of these on the next slides here. And communities have really undertaken retrofitting for a number of reasons. Primary one being to fix past mistakes and maintenance problems. It's a common way to go back and concentrate in particular areas within a municipality or a sub-watershed, go back and find those culverts that might be undersized, the stormwater infrastructure that might cause localized flooding, or those chronic BMPs that are a maintenance nightmare. Also, communities will undertake retrofitting to solve some chronic flooding problems, tied in maybe with the infrastructure, but also, addressing particular stream reaches or going into the stream corridor and adding large retrofit practices to retain flood volumes and before they pass downstream. Communities like the city of Charlottesville, and Dan's here with us today, have also undertaken retrofitting for demonstration education reasons, to show the development community, redevelopment community, how you can use stormwater BMPs on ultra-urban sites and work them in as you're going back and redeveloping sites. I think a primary one to point out is the reducing of pollutants of concern. And, whether it's to address TMDLs or here in the Chesapeake Bay area, tributary strategy goals for the Chesapeake Bay, removing things such as nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment, retrofits can really do a good job at reducing pollutants of concern, both from redevelopment and existing development. We'll move on here to a couple of other big retrofit reasons, and I think a nice one to point out is reducing stormwater runoff volumes, both stormwater runoff volumes that are conveyed into the storm drain system, but also into the combined sewer system. Communities like Portland, Oregon, Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin have used stormwater retrofitting through residential downspout disconnection to reduce stormwater runoff volumes into their combined sewer systems and attack those problems.
Yeah, and Mike, that's a great point maybe to interject, too, that, EPA sometimes makes these rather artificial distinctions between stormwater and CSO cities, and actually many cities actually have both combined systems and separate systems. Right. But a lot of the work that we're doing on the landscape really is about the same objective, which is reducing the amount of the big volumes of stormwater getting into the system, whether that's a separate system as we focus on, or whether that's a combined system that might result then in an overflow at some point. But really the work on the land is the same.
Right. And that's the great thing about retrofitting is that it can help address all of those objectives and all those problems that we have within our watershed. There's a few others up on your screen. Interested in trapping trash and floatables, retrofits can be very effective at doing that. And then they can also help reduce downstream channel erosion and support stream restoration projects by controlling the hydrology from the developed areas upstream of stream restoration corridors. With all that being said, retrofitting is there's great potential behind stormwater retrofitting, but it's important to point out that it's also challenging and can be expensive as well. I think that it's important to point out your required storage volumes or your capture volumes, whether it's for water quality treatment, channel protection, flood control, can get prohibitively large within developed watersheds, particularly when you're going after channel protection and flood control. And depending on the amount of development and the amount of impervious cover within your watershed, you might need a lot of retrofits. I'm talking dozens, maybe hundreds of retrofits to make a real difference and address those goals that you're trying to meet. And that's the crux of the problem. The more developed a watershed becomes, the more help it needs to recover and be restored, the more storage volume and capture volume you have to provide, but the more difficult it becomes to find retrofit sites. So I think that it can be really challenging, but it's fun to get out there in the watersheds and figure out where you can address these problems.
Yeah, and as those who have heard other webcasts in this series, we have talked about the value of, in new development, getting the design right in the first place, because that is always your cheapest option, right, Mike?
That's correct, yeah.
But, in many cases, and I think we'll hear from Charlottesville, which is an already developed area, there aren't that many opportunities to address impacts from new development, and if we're going to make those water quality gains, they're going to have to come from some kind of existing or redevelopment scenario, and that's probably going to be more expensive on an acre-by-acre basis, but that's the world that we live in, I guess, and, we have to tackle that as it comes along, right?
Yeah, since we didn't do it right the first time, we've got to pay 4 times as much to go back and do it right.
Right, well,
now.
Hopefully not 4 times, right?
Well, maybe
3.5.
3.5.
Okay.
Well, continuing on that thread, we've got a little hypothetical watershed example here, and it's a 5,000-acre watershed that we did a little bit of modeling on just to show the amount of storage that you'd have to provide. And by storage, we're talking about really a capture volume to address a number of different restoration objectives, whether it's to improve groundwater recharge, treat water quality, provide channel protection. What this shows is, it's a simple example, but what it shows is that as you get more impervious cover within your watershed, it becomes more difficult to retrofit because you have a larger capture volume that you have to capture and treat or otherwise manage. So I think it's an important point that, you can go after a lot of these problems that you're having within your watersheds. It can be really difficult to get there. And continuing on that example, we're looking at that hypothetical example watershed where we've got 30% impervious cover. We're trying to treat the water quality volume. We've had some, initial stakeholder meetings, and our watershed was developed without adequate stormwater controls. They don't provide water quality treatment, so we're going to go back in, use retrofitting to capture and treat that water quality volume. So setting a reasonable goal of maybe treating 75% of that capture volume, and assuming that we're going to treat 80% of that with storage large-scale retrofits and 20% of it with on-site retrofits and small-scale retrofits. And you can see on your screen we've got some estimates of how much how much impervious acreage that each of those would treat. Running the numbers, we see that we need about 20 of those big retrofits and over 400 of the small-scale retrofits. So as you can see, that's a lot of retrofits. So it can be daunting, but...
Yes, it looks like it could be a very daunting process.
But it can. But I think the great thing about the retrofit manual and the process that we'll talk to today is it lays out a systematic and really process-driven approach to identifying and implementing retrofit projects that can address those problems. And the key is really to use a comprehensive delivery strategy that includes both large-scale and small-scale projects. A lot of stormwater managers will make the mistake of thinking that stormwater retrofits involve just those large-scale capital improvement projects. But a comprehensive retrofit program involves not only those, but also some of the small-scale downspout disconnection type projects as well. And they can be delivered through a variety of methods, through redevelopment projects, through demonstration and education projects. There's a lot of different methods that can be used, and the retrofit manual talks on those methods quite a bit. I think one important one to point out is redevelopment, not only on redevelopment sites, but also using stormwater management criteria on redevelopment sites to perhaps trigger other retrofits off-site in a mitigation type approach or a fee and lieu program type approach.
Yeah, there can be a whole range of design credits and also, if you will, financial credits, particularly in communities that have stormwater utilities. They can set up the fee structure to give financial credits to homeowners and businesses based on retrofit options, which can spur that kind of change through an incentive program. So, yeah, there's a lot of options for getting this done. And the city shouldn't think that they have to pay for and undertake everything themselves. They can find ways to incentivize some of these behaviors and certainly to require them in the redevelopment phase particularly.
That's right.
So we have a poll question. For those who have attended our webcasts before, you know how these work, but I'll explain it real quick. We have a number of these poll questions where we're asking you questions. And so this is our first one here, and we'll have a couple of these spread out throughout the webcast today. So this first one asks, what is your community's experience with stormwater retrofits? And we have a range of answers there. And the way to answer these things is to click on the little radio button, the little circle to the left of to one of the options. So we'll give you a couple seconds to do that. And if you're in a big group, maybe you can figure out some way to come up with an average answer or something like that and report it to us as well. The first one, we have an active stormwater retrofit program. The second one, we've tried a couple of retrofits, but are just kind of getting started there, don't have much of a program set up yet. We're thinking about it, but we haven't done anything yet. And this is the first time we've heard about retrofits as the last option, and that's why we signed on to this webcast. So again, click on the radio button to the left there, and we'll take a look and see what the what the results are there, and we'll show you those in just a second. Okay, it looks like a few people have responded. I'll give you a couple seconds more. And also, by the way, we have several question and answer breaks during this webcast, so make sure to submit your questions to us, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. We've got, I think, 3 or 4 question breaks coming up, so we'll be taking questions from the audience as well.
And that's right, Nikos. The questions are coming in. We just encourage people to type them in as we go along. Don't wait until the first question break to start typing in your question.
All right, let's take a look and see what these results are. So here we have the nifty graphic. Hey, this is pretty impressive. 19% say they have an active retrofit program.
Great.
Wow, that's great. 30% have done a little bit, and then we've got another, about 50% there that are basically getting started. So I guess that's sort of to be expected, but wow, 19%.
I'm impressed by that.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That's great.
Now, we always have people, who want to show their best, put their best foot forward in these webcasts, so we'll see. But if you've got some examples of good retrofit programs that you want to send to us, we would certainly appreciate an email, with some kind of a short description. We can always use that kind of information to help publicize this program. Okay, and so now, as I said, we have Dan Frisbee from the city of Charlottesville in Virginia here with us today, and so we're going to try to intersperse some of the Charlottesville experience with this throughout this webcast. So welcome, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Nikos. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you all today about the City of Charlottesville's stormwater retrofitting experiences, and particularly our stormwater stewardship on public land study. Just to give you a little outline of what I'll cover today in our case study, we'll talk about some of the factors that have led Charlottesville to arrive at the point of even conducting a formal retrofitting study in the first place. We'll walk through the methodology, the process, and the results of the study, and then we'll talk a little bit about how our past experiences with retrofitting and now this study have positioned Charlottesville really to incorporate retrofitting into what we're calling our culture of water resources protection and overall environmental sustainability. And then finally, we'll wrap it all up with a few key pieces of information and advice.
So, Dan, this study is available on your website, right?
It is indeed, and later in the webcast, towards the end, there is a web link on one of my slides to it.
Excellent. It's also in the resources guide.
It is indeed.
That you can click on your console there. And one of the really nice things about this study is that it really does give an organized kind of approach for targeting this. So it's not, as you'll see, it's not just a random sort of hit or miss thing, but there's some real thought behind that. So Charlottesville's a Phase 2 city, right?
That's correct. We are a Phase 2 city, and as such, we've held a stormwater discharge permit from the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation since 2003. Just to get you a little bit familiarized with Charlottesville, if you're not familiar with where we are, we're in central Virginia at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We're the urban center of the Rivanna River watershed, which flows into the James River, which, as many of you know, is a major tributary to the Chesapeake Bay. The picture that was on my first slide was actually of the Rivanna River, and I put that up there because really that's the focal point for a lot of the local stormwater and watershed management activities in the Charlottesville area. We are only about 10.4 square miles as a city, and we've got 40,000 residents. And since we're home to the University of Virginia, we become even more dense when classes are in session because you add about an additional 20,000 students in town.
So for a total of 60,000.
60,000.
Yeah.
So before I get really into the guts of the study itself, I think it's probably useful to talk a little bit about how Charlottesville got to the point of undertaking it in the first place. And really, due in large part to the history of the city, you saw on the first slide, 1888, a lot of the development that took place, and we are mostly built out at this point, a lot of that development took place without the benefit of stormwater management regulations, and certainly without our current understanding of stormwater's relationship to water quality and overall watershed health.
So you lack a lot of that stormwater controls that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. We have a lot of existing development, much of it without any stormwater management whatsoever, simply conveyance. And as a result of that, we do have some fairly major impacts to our urban stream network, including severe stream bank erosion in places and an associated sedimentation problem. Several of our local streams do not meet water quality standards, and we have official TMDLs established. We also recognize that we are part of the greater Chesapeake Bay watershed, so our efforts are not only for our own local streams, but are playing into a larger, significant, and very important restoration effort to address the problems that the Bay is facing today. As Nikos mentioned, and I touched on, we're also a Phase 2 community.
No, not Phase 4.
I guess we
don't want to alarm anybody in the audience there. There's no Phase 3 or Phase 4 coming.
Phase 2. That's probably more appropriate. So we do have a stormwater discharge permit with the 6 minimum control measures that a lot of you are very familiar with out there. And we've found that stormwater retrofitting can be a very effective strategy for addressing various components of our overall stormwater management program. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the retrofitting program is at least partially addressing elements of our permit throughout the course of the presentation. Charlottesville is also a city that's made several formal commitments to environmental stewardship, including adopting an environmental sustainability policy, pursuing an environmental management system. A water protection ordinance was adopted. We signed on to the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. In addition, a whole host of environmental programs and initiatives, energy and water conservation, urban forestry, recycling, are all things that the city is looking at. So this really just fits into the fold nicely as another way that we're addressing overall environmental sustainability.
Dan, just out of curiosity, what's the source of drinking water for the city of Charlottesville?
We have 2 surface water reservoirs. One is up right in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, so it's a very pristine source of water, and another one is a surface water reservoir where actually the Rivanna River is impounded. And we're going through a very comprehensive water supply process in Charlottesville right now. So those issues are very much on people's minds. And beyond those historical impacts we're facing in our environmental commitments, we do have current regulations that are in place for new development in the city. For that new development, we're encouraging and incentivizing use of low-impact development and other water quality-based BMPs. The city itself, when we have the opportunity and we have a new construction project, is also pursuing those kinds of stormwater management. But really, we don't have a lot of new construction that we are actually undertaking. So as a result of all that, we've really come to see that the opportunity and importance of installing BMPs as retrofits on existing public lands is going to be the way to address some of these historic impacts, address some of these commitments, address some water quality goals, while at the same time allowing us to demonstrate and promote the types of practices we want to see widely adopted across the city, public and private. The retrofit ball really got rolling in Charlottesville back in 2005. A potential grant opportunity came up, and it served as the impetus to get some of our folks out in the field and go take a first look at a subset of some of our public lands to assess where did we have some retrofit opportunities. We evaluated a few properties, and admittedly, we had little distinct methodology, established performance goals, scientific evaluation criteria, a lot of things you're going to hear us talking about throughout the course of the webcast. But we did come up with a spot. It was our Greenleaf Park, and it was identified to be a great place to put a rain garden. We pursued and received the grant from EPA's Chesapeake Bay program in the Virginia DCR. The design was contracted out, and then our own crews actually developed a landscape plan and constructed the rain garden in the park. And now here's where I want to make the first tie back to our MS4 permit, MCMs 1 and 2, public education, outreach, and involvement. And this is because nearly 50 volunteers from the community assisted in this project, whether it be tasks in the construction such as grading, laying filter fabric, mulching, planting plants. we also had a web page that tracked the construction progress so the community could see lots of pictures and description of the different pieces of the construction, what went into it. And we also have some very high-quality educational signage out on the site for folks to come and take a look at. The retrofit, even beyond that, has served as public education piece. We've had tours for the public there. It's an outdoor classroom for a local elementary school. Environmental news stories by the media have been staged there. So all the success associated with this retrofit led us to feel we want to do some more of these things. But we got to the point where we thought, we really need to look at this in a methodical, strategic, and defensible examination beyond just going and picking one here, one there. So this kind of got us to the point where the Stormwater Stewardship on Public Land study was conceived. We decided to limit the study to public lands, and particularly to parks and school campuses, because we really wanted these retrofits to be publicly accessible so that they could serve as demonstration projects and interactive learning opportunities for the community. So early in the process, we pulled in some key partners, including those that are listed on the slide here, and we collaborated together on a grant proposal, which we were awarded by National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And the Center for Watershed Protection was selected as the contractor to perform the study, which was a perfect fit given the fact that at the time they were working on and finalizing the Retrofit Practices manual we're going to be hearing more about today. So the major study objectives included the systematic evaluation of our parks and school campuses in order to identify really a prioritized set of retrofits that would improve water quality. We wanted it to remove pollutants, increase groundwater recharge, decrease stormwater volume and velocity. And the end result would be a catalog of retrofit opportunities that were tailored to those particular sites in and around the public lands, and which could serve as stormwater education and outreach opportunities. The study was envisioned to be a blueprint and a guide that we would use for future city retrofitting efforts.
Thanks, Dan. And it's interesting, too, and, what you're saying is how this idea of a demonstration project, can then blossom. And, of course, as you mentioned, have multiple objectives, across various parts of the regulatory program, as you mentioned, education and outreach and public involvement. And it's interesting, too, maybe you could just say a little bit more about why you decided or what advantage you thought it was to focus on public lands kind of as your first strategy.
Sure. First and foremost, we really wanted the projects to be publicly accessible and as publicly accessible as possible. So that's not only public lands, but, for example, not our public works yard where we don't want a lot of folks wandering in and out of, but schools and parks that are open for folks just to come in that we can lead guided tours through if we want to. And we wanted to utilize those public lands to provide some real tangible examples of the kind of stormwater management we want to see. And since we have control over those properties, it really made sense. And frankly, we had to kind of limit the scope somewhere because we couldn't take on the entire city of Charlottesville as a whole. So all of those things combined, it seemed to make the most sense to say parks and schools will start there, and if in the future we can expand our search.
Yeah, and that makes sense, particularly in the issue of having control, as you kind of get, and we'll talk about this more later, but, as a kind of cost-benefit as to, the different things that you're going to evaluate, having control over the land is definitely a benefit to moving forward with a particular project.
Right. And the great thing about the city's scope and their approach was that it was very focused and had a real purpose, and we'll touch on that more today.
Okay, so we've got another poll question here, actually two poll questions. These are the basics so that we can get a better idea of who's with us. So this first one just asks you who you're with. Are you with a Phase 1 MS4, a Phase 2 MS4? And by the way, apologies to any Phase 1 cities. I keep mentioning the 6 minimum measures, which are in the Phase 2 program, but the same basic ideas appear in most all of the permits of the Phase 1 program, so we hope this applies to you as well. Are you with a state or federal government, consultant, industry, or some other group that we haven't mentioned there? So again, just choose the radio button to the left of the answer that best applies to you, and we'll take a look and see what those results are. Let's see, we've got a pretty good selection here, so just in the interest of time, I'll show you what we've got so far. Let's see, we've got 14% are in Phase 1 cities, 30% in Phase 2 as expected. Actually, looks like a very good representation from state and federal governments today, 24% there. That's quite higher than usual. 20%, 21% consultants. And that's pretty common, actually, because there's a lot of consultants out there that work directly for Phase 1 and Phase 2 cities and do a lot of helping out there. So, and then we have one more question here for you, which I'll show you now. And this really helps us get a better tally of how many people are out there. We know there are people sitting in their cubes by themselves, but we also know there's conference rooms set up around the country where there are multiple people. So if somebody can get to a computer and give us an answer there, again, just select the radio button. If you can't get to the computer and want to send us your answer via email later on, we can accept that as well. But this will help us get a better tally of how many people are participating today.
Yeah, and actually, Nikos, while people are doing that, if you have a room with a lot of people in it, more than 20, if you can click the radio button for more than 20, but then also in the Ask a Question box, give us the estimate for how many people are in your room. That helps us get a better estimate of how many people are signed in.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, those people in Beaufort County, South Carolina, better tell us how many people are there listening in today.
Yeah, and actually, while we wait for people to respond in, I would like to remind people that if you want the slides, there is, I believe, a download slides button on your screen that you can click and download a PDF of the slides. And then also there's a resources button where you can click that and download a PDF of the resources, which will include copies of these forms that Mike and Deb are going to be talking about next, I believe.
Okay, so looks like we've got some results here. Let's get those out. Okay, most people are in cube land today, and that applies to, I think, everybody in this room. And then we've got some groups there, so very good. Again, if you've got a big group and want to tell us how many people are in that group, we would certainly like to know. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next part of this. So now it's incumbent upon me to make fun of the Center for Watershed Protection because of this diagram. They call it the football diagram, which if you're at all familiar with any of those products, you'll see rehashed over and over and over and over again in any possible scenario. They always seem to manage to come up with 8 steps of whatever the heck it is, and they just change the captions under there and then sell it back to the government as a final product, right, Mike?
Right. Well, it's a nice round number, and we save money in producing graphics, so
absolutely,
we're looking out for you.
They are very efficient. All right, so Mike, why don't you take us into some of the details here, and we're going to go through some of these steps, right?
Sure. We talked a little bit about why retrofit, to address specific problems within our watershed. Now we're going to talk about how you go about addressing those problems through this systematic 8-step process used to find and implement retrofit projects. And this process, which we've developed over the years at the center, is cost-effective, I think applicable to both small and large watersheds, and it can be scaled for both small on-site practices as well as large storage-type retrofits. Before we dive into the particulars of the process, I did want to point out a few prerequisites because retrofitting is a little bit different than designing a new stormwater practice. And in that regard, you're going to be instead of working with a clean slate and a nice new greenfield development site, you're going to be working in a heavily developed, site with a lot of site constraints. So it's going to require a lot of creativity, a lot of investigative skills, some patience, and you also need the technical knowledge about hydrology and hydraulics and stormwater engineering, local stormwater management practices that have been used, a knowledge of potential retrofit locations, and an understanding of the big picture. And I think this is something that we never should lose sight of when we undertake any of these efforts. The City of Charlottesville had a great focus for their retrofit study, but whether it's a nice wooded riparian stream corridor or an estuary or a coastal marshland or a drinking water reservoir, you've got to keep in mind what you're actually working for and the goals that you're trying to meet with retrofitting. So without any further ado, we'll dive in to step 1 of the process, which is retrofit scoping. And I pointed out at the end of Dan's presentation that giving your retrofit program, a specific focus and purpose is extremely important. So we'll spend a lot of time on this step this morning, and through retrofit scoping, you're defining that strategy that's going to meet those goals that you want to meet in your watershed and really tackle those problems. There's a few key tasks that are involved. I'm not going to spend time on that first one there on your screen, but the last three we're going to talk about in more detail this morning. First of those tasks is defining your retrofit objectives. And again, this is tying your retrofitting into what you're actually working for, answering and solving the problems that you're actually trying to address. And we have some nice example stormwater retrofitting objectives up into the screen. But the key point here is to tie maybe your larger big picture restoration objectives, reducing pollutants of concern that might be conveyed into a bay or drinking water reservoir into a specific and measurable retrofitting goal. So we have a few examples here on the screen of how you could tie, big picture restoration objectives into some retrofitting actions. So the key is to, translate those big picture goals into more specific, measurable goals, and to make sure that those goals are realistic as well.
Now, everybody noticed you said measurable goals. Very good, Mike.
That's right.
Yeah,
so setting some bars to hit, and not setting them too high that you can't ever jump over them, but giving a real purpose to your retrofitting study. And I think, while it's nice to look at these hypothetical examples, I think we should take a good look at what the city of Charlottesville did in defining their retrofit goals and scoping their program out.
Sure, we'll talk about that a little bit more. We talked earlier about the overall objectives of the study that were developed when the idea was hatched, but early in the process, we also came up with some performance goals for the retrofits that we'd be searching for, like generally the ones Mike had on his last slide. And we really took care to ensure that the specific retrofit performance goals were complementary to and would help achieve the overall study objectives. We had a kickoff meeting with the center in the city. First of all, they gave us a good review of what retrofitting was, and then some group discussions, some subsequent meetings resulted in the performance goals that you see on your screen here. Now, I'm not going to read through them all, but I'll touch on a few of them. The primary goals, pollutant removal, and we chose to focus on local and regional pollutants of concern. Sedimentation, as I had mentioned before, has been identified as one of the greatest threats to the health of the Rivanna River watershed where Charlottesville is, and several of our local streams that have the TMDLs are for bacteria. So those were certainly pollutants that we were interested in seeing these retrofits address. Nitrogen and phosphorus are two of the major nutrients being targeted for reductions in Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts. So those are also ones we wanted to look at. Runoff reduction, we wanted retrofits that could achieve overall reductions in stormwater volume, which lead to helping to address some of that downstream channel erosion issues, which then gets to your sedimentation problem. So trying to look at these things in the context of what really are our local water quality goals and issues that we're trying to address. A couple of the secondary goals, just to give you another idea, the naturalization and recreation one you see there. Since these were schools and parks, we wanted to ensure that there was going to be a sensitivity to the existing and future active recreational programs on those public lands. We didn't want there to be conflicts and be fighting over what we're going to do on these public spaces. In quick implementation, we felt it was really important to identify a few retrofits that we could implement right away in the near future in order to capitalize on that momentum created by the study.
Well, thanks. I'll take it from here. This is Deb Caraco.
Oh, sorry, Deb.
No, that's okay.
Momentarily spaced out, yes. Welcome, Deb Caraco, who now gets to actually talk, who's been patiently sitting here for a little while. Thanks, Deb, for coming down from New York State to join us today.
Thank you. I'm going to be discussing during this portion the different locations where stormwater retrofits can be placed. The retrofit manual divides retrofits into two larger groups, storage retrofits and on-site retrofits. They're described in detail in Chapter 2 of the manual. And again, I want to emphasize that the word storage refers to both storage within ponds as well as overall watershed storage and fire retention, other types of practices.
Yeah, so when we talk about storage, we're not trying to imply big ponds only. That might be one of your options. But infiltration, into the ground is also a storage option, and we'll talk about a range of those things. So hopefully nobody's sort of confused. You know, we're always trying to find the right terminology and the right way to say things, and, you know, sometimes there's a little bit of a force fit with some of these words.
It's true, and again, we're to almost Nikos' favorite diagram. This one only has 6
balls.
Changed. That's true. So
6?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of graphics effort to produce this one. Just describing the different. So storage retrofits are basically retrofits that capture a large drainage area. These are our big site retrofits. Typically, they're capturing on the order of 5 to 500 acres. They typically can address both quality and quantity, channel protection types of criteria. Usually, they would be located on public lands. The most common types of practices that get used in these are ponds and wetlands. As far as cost, they're typically moderately cost per acre, and they are, in general, quite difficult to implement on very highly urbanized watersheds. Some of the typical ones are described here. You're looking at existing ponds, very large parking lots within the conveyance system. So again, you're looking for areas where you can capture a quite large drainage area. And in a little bit, I'm going to highlight a couple of different types of practices among these, types of locations among these, excuse me. I'm sorry.
Oh, and yeah, now one with 7. How innovative.
I think the footballs might be stretched a little bit to accommodate the 7 as well. The other large group of retrofits or a category of locations of retrofits are on-site retrofits. So these practices are typically capturing less than 5 acres. Sometimes the individual practice would capture as small as 1/10 of an acre. Typically, the primary goal as far as your what you're trying to achieve with them is for water quality and for groundwater recharge. It's typically hard to accommodate flood control or channel protection goals within these practices. Very often, not always, but very often, a community will have to look to locations on private property as well as public property. And the types of practices are looking against these very small scale, typically looking at stormwater filtering types of practices, small infiltration practices, some low impact development types of techniques. They're typically more expensive per acre than the storage retrofits, and they can be applied typically within the ultra-urban setting. So again, in looking at the specific locations you can use, we're looking to these smaller areas, targeting hotspot operations. So this might be, for example, within an individual gas station, individual rooftops. Just looking at small areas of streets.
Yeah, so some of those particularly would be good when a site's being redeveloped, so that you can apply those as part of your redevelopment package that you negotiate with the developer.
Yeah, that's right. That's a great point. All right. So when you're trying to decide which locations or which blend of locations you want to go to conduct your retrofit inventory or to select which types of retrofits you're going to use, you have to consider unique challenges for each one, as well as the overall, again, not losing sight of what objectives are you trying to achieve. Now, Charlottesville, Dan, I know you were discussing public ownership was an important criterion that you used in your initial selection. I think that's true for many communities. And I just wanted to next, in the next few slides, just go in a little bit more detail as far as some of the specific retrofits locations that can be used. Within the manual, there's a coding of SR for storage retrofits and OS for on-site retrofits. One of the most common things to do when you're doing a retrofit inventory is just looking to existing ponds. These are some of the easiest areas to conduct a stormwater retrofit, especially in communities that have had a history of flood control but maybe not water quality. Okay. some of the strategies you're trying to do within existing ponds, often you're trying to somehow increase the volume of the pond so that you can, for example, accommodate both water quality and channel protection in a pond that had historically only done flood control. One of the things you do when you go to the pond, look to see if you can perhaps excavate the pond bottom. You would want the pond bottom to be flat and dry, ideally, in order to do that, or if perhaps there's room to raise the pond embankment to create more volume within the pond. Sometimes ponds have done several controls for several different storms, and you can then trade storage that is used, storage that has been traditionally used for example, controlling a 2-year storm design, and then change that outlet structure so that you can achieve more goals. Another thing that's commonly done within existing ponds is just adding elements that provide for additional water quality, providing a longer flow path. Sometimes ponds will have a concrete channel through them, and going through and modifying that so you can get just some additional stormwater quality treatment within the existing facility. Typically, these start out as ponds. Often they start out perhaps as a dry facility. The end product is a pond or wetland.
I think it's important to point out that's a very common one since a lot of our watersheds were developed, maybe 20, 30 years ago. Maybe you had flood control. Good opportunity to convert, to get water quality treatment in those ponds.
Yeah, and a lot of the ponds, as we talked about in our last webcast on BMP performance, frankly, are underperforming BMPs. And so there are some things, as Deb mentioned, that we can do to make them better performing. For instance, taking a dry pond and perhaps turning it into a wet pond, or taking a wet pond and turning it into a wetland, or adding trees, or extending the flow paths, or doing all sorts of things to make those have higher values, not only for water quality, but for habitat and things like that.
It's true. And another opportunity within pond retrofits is that you're revisiting a past practice that perhaps even just needs some simple maintenance. So you're able to kind of get two things done at one time when you go to ponds, because you can just do kind of a standard inspection of the pond just to see, does it need regular maintenance, does it need to have sediment removed, and at the same time, improve the water quality. In general, ponds have less challenges than other practices. One place where it can be difficult is where the pond barely has enough volume or space to achieve its original design goal.
Why don't we move ahead here, just in the interest of time, and talk about the hotspot one.
Okay. All right, so stormwater, as Nikos is moving on through, I'll just start talking about them a little bit. Stormwater hotspots can encompass various land uses within commercial, industrial, sometimes a highway barn, for example, could be a municipal hotspot. These are areas within the watershed that have the highest level of stormwater pollutants. Typically, the hydrocarbons, the nurseries pictured here, might have a very high nutrient loads. Even if you're able to capture much of the watershed within some of the larger storage retrofits, it's really important to focus on these areas that can include a very significant amount of the pollutant load within the watershed.
One question we get asked a lot, Deb, is whether we can use LID kinds of concepts that promote infiltration in a hotspot area.
And that's a very good question. Typically, infiltration is highly restricted within hotspot operations just because of concerns of contaminating the groundwater. Another piece of information we were talking about before the webcast was, for example, if you use porous pavement, you can end up with an area that if you had an oil spill, for example, that would be capturing all this oil below ground. However, one application where you could try to do it is if you use a treatment practice prior to that infiltration practice. Sometimes you could even do it with a very large pre-treatment practice, such as an oil grit separator. And in some areas, especially if they're concerned about contaminating a sole source aquifer, they may require complete stormwater treatment via something such as a filter before infiltrating.
Yeah, those are all good points. So it's very site-specific, but it's certainly not out of the question, I guess, is the net result of that.
Yeah. Again, on hotspot operations, typically the types of practices we mostly would focus on are stormwater filtering practices. Sand filter would be really the classic practice that would be used in a hotspot. Often, this can be coupled with pre-treatment types of practices again, such as oil grit separators. That one of the main things they can do is, if there is some sort of spill, act to capture that. One thing I always want to emphasize on these too, though, is that for many hotspots, it's the land use, but it's the specific operations that happen within that land use that create the pollutant load. There's another manual, the Manual 8, that looks very much like Manual 3, the Pollution Source Control Practices Manual, that really goes through and looks at some of the specific practices you can do on hotspots to try to minimize their pollutant potential combined with retrofitting. Another one of the on-site types of retrofits is small parking lots. Often, this would be, again, a mixture of some of these might be public property, some of them might be private property. And this is the classic place to really implement a lot of the low-impact development types of practices. Within a parking lot, you're typically dividing it up and trying to look for places to implement several smaller practices rather than looking at one large practice. And this next slide just shows kind of a conceptual view of how a small parking lot might be looked at. Again, looking at just several types of practices. Often you would be looking at some site design, just reducing impervious cover. Often we'll go out to a site and just say, I think this parking lot could be reduced in size, reducing impervious cover, combined with some of the filtering practices. And in this example, looking to the landscaped islands and saying maybe they could be used as bioretention, or perhaps we could use bioretention at the perimeter of the site. Sometimes we might use a swale type of practice. Sometimes look to the parking lot and see as overflow parking area, and maybe we could use a permeable pavement in that area. Sometimes we might even include some kind of a sand filter. In this design, toward the top, there's a perimeter sand filter. So again, you're looking at quite a few different options within the same site often. Individual rooftops. This one, I think one of the really important kind of take-home messages with it is rooftops, both commercial and individual, are kind of scattered throughout the watershed, and both of them present unique challenges. And I'll talk a little bit in the others about the specific mechanisms of treating these rooftops. But one of the really important things is the delivery system to make these happen. Typically, when you're doing rooftop retrofits, it would be asking many individuals to try to do it. Some of the places that have some good programs for this is Portland, Oregon, which has a rooftop disconnection program that includes a combination of financial incentives as well as technical support to help individuals conduct rooftop runoff. Some type of rooftop treatment might be required as a part of redevelopment in some other areas. Nikos coming with a specific link on this, but the Green Infrastructure website?
Yeah, for our NPDES Green Infrastructure Initiative, which is on the EPA website at epa.gov/NPDES/Green Infrastructure, has a bunch of information about green roofs in particular as one possible option for implementing this sort of, if you will, effective rooftop disconnection.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And again, I'd like to just look a little bit more detail into each of the types. Residential rooftops present a very different type of challenge and a different type of strategy that you might use than commercial rooftops, or just in general large, flatter rooftops. Residential rooftops typically may be using very small practices like a rain barrel or a small rain garden, and one of the real things we're looking at is just trying to catch each individual downspout. Commercial rooftops, on the other hand, often there's a kind of a larger area that's draining to each practice you might use. sometimes they even have an internal drainage system. So you may be looking to something much more structural or a significant undertaking, like such as a green rooftop. Rather than using rain barrels, again, a very similar type of practice would be to use much larger cisterns that can, in some cases, actually be combined with the irrigation system, or occasionally even can be used for gray water within the building. Okay, and then, again, as you're just kind of summing up, as you're going through and trying to decide where you would like to retrofit within the watershed, it's really important to understand what your different retrofit options are, what your restrictions are as far as property ownership, and combine those again with trying to make sure you're able to achieve the goals you need to for your retrofit option.
All right, thank you, Deb.
Yeah.
We have a quick poll question here, which I'm going to try to hopefully fit in. We've got want to find out, particularly for those of you who've done some retrofits before, what kinds of practices you might have used in the past. So same thing as before, just choose one of the options. Perhaps you've used more than one, but just pick the most common one if you've used several. And we'll take a look at the answer there. And actually we're doing, I think, okay on time, so we'll manage to wrap this up and have plenty of time for questions. So let's see what the results are here. We've got, we need some more people to report. Come on, guys. Start clicking those computers there. We only have 18 people reporting so far.
Maybe some of them lied about the extent of their
All right, well, let's see what we've got here. Okay, now we got some better results here. Oh, look. This is interesting.
Oh, great.
Wow. 26 and 28% there for bioretention and swale. Wow, that's encouraging. Those are among the more effective practices that we see. Extended detention there, that kind of dry pond at about 17%. Wet ponds trailing that at 11. It's kind of like a horse race here. Poor wetlands, only 3.3%. Well, that's not so good. Those wetlands really can be somewhat more effective than some of the other ones. So anyway, very interesting poll results there. So we will continue on now. And Deb, so now we're going to talk about how we figure out what the preferred practices are.
Again, so I guess you all understand which of these practices were since you're responding to the poll question. But again, using kind of a full suite of practices that are available. Within ponds, you can have drier ponds that use extended detention, wet ponds that use a permanent pool, and wetlands. Again, that first kind of category, wet ponds, extended detention, wetland, typically work very well when they're capturing a much larger drainage area. The remainder, bioretention, filtering, infiltration, and swales are typically applied more with the on-site retrofits, or at least for smaller drainage area practices. Other can include a wide variety of practices. It can include some pre-treatment types of practices. Again, I think I'd mentioned oil water separator, or just even deep some catch basins included. Also, the whole variety of low-impact development practices can also be considered as part of retrofitting. Okay. And I just want to talk a little bit about the ways to choose the practices. A lot of which practices you choose is going to fall out of the locations you're able to do it. So again, if you have gone through and decided that the main thing that you want to do is focus on your existing ponds, then that's going to lead you toward, of course, pond retrofits. If again you've decided instead you want to focus on a bunch of smaller parking lots within the watershed, or look at some on-site kinds of practices, you're going to be looking more toward practices like bioretention, practices like of low-impact development. And one of the other things you really want to consider as you get a little bit more specific is how much do the practices cost? How are they able to remove pollutants? if you have a goal of reducing the volume of runoff, you might want to look to infiltration practices as well. Another thing that's really important to consider as well is just the long-term maintenance. Or, is your community going to be able to deal with, many small practices, or the maintenance burden of each of these practices? And another part I'll talk about a little bit more when I'm speaking later in the webcast is other benefits to the community. Is it safe? Is it a safe practice? Does the community view it as a benefit? And Dan, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the ways that you decided to assess or define which ones you wanted to do.
Sure. When we came into our study, I guess we maybe came into it slightly differently because we weren't really locked into any particular practices when we came in, and that was really for several reasons. The sites that we were dealing with really kind of span the range from wide open spaces for some of our bigger parks to very urban school campuses where there's just not a lot of room. So we had a lot of latitude for the types of practices. We wanted to look at both storage and on-site opportunities, and we were holding out some hope that we would find some good opportunities to really accomplish some significant sub-watershed treatment on some of our properties. And we did find a couple of those instances, but we ended up finding a large majority to be on-site practices, which was fine. We wanted to do the study to assess what our potential options were. We came into it wanting practices that would provide water quality treatment through filtering and infiltration. We wanted to address volume issues and address channel protection issues. So we kind of came into it knowing what we wanted to get out of it and the types of places that were there, and then went out and did the assessment, and it just kind of naturally fell out which practices matched up and met those performance goals.
Oh, that's a good point, thanks.
Yeah, I think either way that you come about going at this, you're still trying to figure out basically, what your highest priorities are going to be and what your most sort of cost-effective approaches will be and all that sort of stuff. So there are probably multiple ways of skinning the cat, if you will, but
Sure. And another thing the manual has, which can be helpful in this process, is Appendix E of the manual has some detailed cost information, both by practice and by location. And Appendices B and D have information regarding pollutant removal of the different practices. So that's another, as far as how to evaluate each of the different practices. Chapter 3 outlines, the different practice options there are for stormwater retrofits, and this table just showed a little bit to kind of go over how, what it means. It looks at, for each location, what types of practices are the most applicable, and I'll just go over some of the ones that we already talked about. For SR1, which is existing ponds, the black dots would be, it's the preferred option. So, within existing ponds, we're going to be leaning more toward extended tension or wet ponds or wetlands. You can occasionally try to incorporate bioretention or filtering elements within existing ponds. And sometimes it's a little bit, of course, swales and infiltration are a little bit more difficult to incorporate. Looking at hot spots, the easiest practices to incorporate are typically bioretention and filtering. So you can kind of use this as a screening to say, okay, here's the types of locations I was able to find within my watershed. What are the practices that I'm going to most easily gravitate toward once I have those practices in place? Okay.
Great. And on this next slide, we have some additional information for you on BMP performance. So that you can look at some of the different websites out there. Our webcast from last time, the Urban BMP Performance Tool that we have, the International BMP Database that we featured last time, the Center for Watershed Protection's Pollutant Removal Database, and a number of other manuals that have information as well. And so while you're looking at that, John, why don't we take some questions from the audience? I'll just leave this slide up there for a few seconds. Sure. I imagine we must have some questions now.
We have tons of questions. The first question is actually for Dan. Jerry asks for Dan, if possible, to identify what was the one issue that convinced your governing body to launch the initial retrofit screening effort? Why did they do it?
Well, I guess it's hard to pick out one in particular. It really is a whole host of issues that were coming together at the same time, and it gets back to one of the slides I had up earlier for how did we get here. It is the fact that, maybe first and foremost, we have a citizenry in Charlottesville that is really interested and very engaged in water quality and stormwater issues, and it just, if anything, we're not moving fast enough. So it's really just was an obvious choice. This came to us as an obvious choice to mix it in with our MS4 permit and really just to kind of keep the ball rolling and keep the momentum going on these issues.
Great. The next question is Daryl from Virginia, and I'll open up to either Deb or Mike. But yes, how important is it to perform retrofits on a coordinated basis with some strategy versus doing them on a kind of isolated one-by-one basis as they present themselves?
In my opinion would be, I think it's pretty important to try to do it on a coordinated basis. One of the main reasons, at least in my opinion, that's important to do is because I think you save money in the long term by trying to achieve a specific goal for the lowest possible cost. I mean, there's some initial cost to going out and doing field work and a comprehensive assessment, but I think that it pays off in the long term to try to find what the really best bang for the buck is.
I think that's the point right there. I mean, you use your time and your money most effectively when you perform retrofitting systematically.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think we make a stronger connection to water quality benefits. It's certainly possible to do some retrofits in your watersheds that might be great demonstration projects and, might be valuable for some other reasons, but they may not have that great water quality benefits. And so if you strategically pick the sites that you're looking at, you may be able to hit multiple benefits there of both having, as Charlottesville did, education and outreach, and also something that's actually contributing to water quality improvements.
Right. Great. Next question. Keith from Las Vegas brings up the small versus large on-site BMP issue. He asks, to meet required storage volumes for flood control or channel protection, is it better to have a dozen larger detention basins to minimize maintenance headaches, etc., or hundreds of smaller detention on-site areas scattered throughout the city?
I think that the approach that a lot of communities have taken to particularly address flood control rather than doing it spread out across the entire sub-watershed is to pick one or two particular stream reaches or problem areas and provide larger regional detention-type facilities to address that particular restoration objective.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, too. It's again, for flood control, channel protection, you're typically looking to the larger practices.
I think, too, just to add a slightly different point of view on this one, that it's a choice. One of the things that we talk about with low-impact development is you are going to have many more practices to deal with. And so the city should be sort of cognizant of that in terms of the long-term management of those things. And it's true that it might be easier to manage a few big ponds than it is to manage 100 bioretention cells or 200 bioretention cells. But you also have to figure out, whether that's really going to get you to your water quality objectives. Right. And, there are lots of cases where having big wet ponds is not going to do it. For instance, you've got a cold water fishery with a lot of channel erosion problems. Having wet ponds is not going to address the temperature issues and is not going to address those overall volume issues either. So you may want to invest more of your energy into the bioretention program, noting that, yes, it's going to take more education, more outreach, more inspections, and all that stuff, but knowing that that's going to be the way you're going to get to your water quality objective.
I think that's a great point, Nikos. And one of the things I tried to stress earlier is that retrofitting should be viewed as being able to address a whole slew of watershed problems, not only flood control and channel protection, but also water quality and also demonstration education. The benefit of using some of those smaller on-site practices is that they allow you to meet those objectives often more effectively than the larger single-use facilities.
And I think a point you had earlier, too, Mike, that is kind of overall to all of this is that often when you do a retrofit analysis, you end up trying to use a combination of small and large site practices. And some of, again, it's like especially within existing ponds, some of those larger ones are really easy to get at, but you probably do need to combine several different types of practices to meet your long-term objectives.
Great. Next question is from Thomas in Arizona. Reminds us again about arid areas. We always seem to sometimes forget that these areas have different needs. But in areas such as Phoenix, with only 3 to 7 inches of rainfall, no real flowable streams to discharge into, what type of practices or BMPs or could they be looking at for retrofits?
Well, the city of Tucson actually has, I think, what's a pretty good rainwater harvesting type manual, and not rainwater harvesting in the idea of cisterns and rain barrels like we might think about outside of those arid climates down there, but grading the landscaping in a way that captures and retains the groundwater on site and allows it to infiltrate and recharge some of those shallow groundwater aquifers. So I think in those cases it can be as simple as downspout disconnection to grading, where the stormwater is allowed to perhaps filter through some native vegetation on the site and pass into the ground and recharge some of those groundwater aquifers that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. We were in Phoenix not too long ago, and talked about how we might balance some of these things, because in those kinds of climates, the whole flood issue is, a bigger issue. And so you might want to choose things differently based on sort of elevating that flood protection criteria and sort of adjust your scope that way in those drier climates.
Okay, last question for this Q&A session is for Dan. And Jeff from Ohio asks, who maintains the stormwater quality BMPs you've been able to install as part of the retrofits? Is it the city or private? Or
The ones that we have installed up to this point are all publicly owned and on public lands, in a park, in a school. So it is city operations, our public works department, and crews that would go in and do any maintenance that's needed. And if it gets to be anything really technical, we would maybe have to bring in some outside help. But in some of the bioretention situations where some of the maintenance is really maintenance and upkeep of the plants and some of the materials, we've got a great volunteer coordinator that really engages the community and brings in activist groups to come in and help do some mulching, help take care of the plants. So it's really a combination.
Okay, let's get ourselves back on track here. We'll have another, I think, 2 question and answer breaks later on in this. So Mike, you want to take it away? We're going to now talk about how to do some initial screening, so you have a basic direction of where to go and look around. So desktop analysis is the first thing.
That's right. So we talked a lot about scoping and giving your retrofit program a specific focus and a specific direction. So after completing step 1, you should have a really good idea about the retrofit objectives that you've got and the locations and practices that will help you most effectively meet those objectives. So in this desktop assessment step, you're rapidly searching for and assessing potential retrofit sites. The idea is to save yourself a lot of time in the field by spending time in your cube or your office identifying potential locations to go out and further investigate. Now, several key tasks include securing GIS data or other mapping data, conducting a desktop search for retrofit sites, and then preparing some base maps that can be used during field work. The first task that you need to tackle is to secure mapping data, whether that's GIS or paper maps. I just point out that while you can use paper maps, I think GIS data is really the best way to go, because not only can you do your desktop assessment quicker and more efficiently, but it's also an ideal way to store some of that retrofit data that you collect as you move through the rest of the process. And there's some essential data that you need: topography, hydrology, some of those other ones listed on your screen. Dan, I think the city of Charlottesville did a great job with their desktop assessment, and I believe you guys use the city's GIS to do that, correct?
That's correct. We have some really great GIS data that we've collected in the city, and we were able to hand a lot of that data over to the center. They did a wonderful job doing some analysis of that data, and the point of that was to get an initial ranking of the retrofit potential for some of these public lands we were going to visit. The task really was essential in order to kind of initially prioritize the best opportunities that were out there. Existing data and photography were analyzed, first of all, to refine some of the city's sub-watersheds, which was in need, as well to analyze drainage areas for each of the public properties, and to digitize impervious surfaces on each of the public properties as well. After all that was done, we went through a process of categorizing each property as either contributing, receiving, or mixed. And the point of this was to get a better indication of what kinds of practices we might be able to accomplish on these sites. Contributing properties, such as the one you're going to see in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, are located at or close to the upper reaches of the subwatershed. They are really contributing runoff to the downstream system, but receiving little from off-site. So because of that, most of your potential is going to be to treat on-site runoff from those sites. Receiving properties, on the other hand, such as the one in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, are located near the bottom or the downstream end of a subwatershed. So in contrast to contributing properties, they might be receiving quite a bit of runoff from upstream, off-site areas. So there's at least the potential there to divert, capture, and treat off-site runoff on these properties. Now, the actual feasibility of doing this is dependent on a lot of site conditions, such as slope, flow, existing infrastructure on those properties, and area that's actually available for treatment, not just the area of the property itself. So field investigations for those sites can look at both on-site and off-site runoff treatment. Mixed properties, as you can probably imagine, are somewhere in the middle of the subwatershed and can also consider both. Some further analysis was done to look at amounts of runoff and available space that could be treated, needs from previous city watershed assessment efforts. And all of this led to an identification of properties with high, medium, and low retrofit potential. And those were the ones that were prioritized for field work.
Great. I think the city did a great job with their desktop assessment. I remember being down there last July in the 100-degree weather and really being thankful for the amount of time that you guys spent finding the most effective sites and the best sites for potential retrofitting. What the city did, that level of detail, might be a little beyond what most communities will do. A lot of communities will just use their desktop assessments to find a list of potential sites to go out and visit rather than doing the detailed assessment that the city did. These next couple slides show some of the search criteria that you can use to assess your base maps, your GIS information for potential retrofit locations. So both storage retrofits and on-site retrofits can be searched for on the desktop. I would just point out that on-site retrofits are usually a little more difficult to identify from the desktop just because it's hard to tell from aerial photography whether or not you can disconnect a downspout or treat a little bit of a parking lot in a bioretention area.
Yeah, probably your resolution's not high enough to see that small detail, right?
That's right. So what you can do is pick out general areas to go out and then get out in the field and assess the potential for on-site retrofits. So before you can jump out in the field, recommend preparing some base maps for each of those potential retrofit sites. Really helps a lot when you're out at the site to collect information quickly, particularly for existing conditions. And level of detail is really determined by the available data and by the preferences of the field crew, but there's some essential data that you need to include on the base maps, which you can see on your screen. Just like to point out that, well, it can be tempting to add a lot more data that might help in your site assessment, maybe soils information, property ownership, land use. A lot of that stuff tends to clutter up your map, so they actually become less useful to the field crews out at the site. Just on your screen now is an example of a nice, clean, and simple base map. Notice that we still have some useful layers on there, topo, aerial photo, the storm drain infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure. Leaves a lot of room for notes and sketching. So I think this is a good example of how to prepare your base maps. So now we're going to dive into, once you've done your scoping and you've picked out your locations that are going to allow you to potentially meet your retrofit objectives most effectively, you're actually going to get out in the field and assess those retrofit sites. And this is where the fun really comes in. Going to collect all the information you need to determine whether or not a retrofit practice can be installed at the site, and you're collecting that information to create an initial concept design and some sketches and descriptions. So there's a couple of key tasks. We'll talk a little bit about each one of those here on the next few slides. There's some advanced preparation work that you all need to do before heading out in the field to conduct your site assessment. And that's really just gathering your equipment, your base maps, your materials. This table on screen right now shows the equipment that you need, and all this stuff is really useful for assessing site conditions and recording what you see out there. Materials that you need are the field forms, the RRI forms, retrofit reconnaissance inventory forms, which we've included a blank copy of in your resource packet. Retrofit field guide, authorization letters from the city or local government or regional maybe authority, explaining to property owners what you're doing out there, especially if you're going on the private property, contact numbers in case of emergency, and then photo ID and business cards. Some of you may be wondering exactly what the field guide is. Basically, that's a simplified guide to provide field crews with some guidance on conducting retrofitting in a consistent manner. You might have multiple crews going out, so that field guide can help them assess sites in similar ways. And we've included a template for that field guide in the additional resources for this webcast. So now you're all set. You're finally ready to go out in the field and spend some time out there, take pictures, make sketches. We've developed a pretty nice retrofit reconnaissance inventory form to help your field crews quickly and efficiently address retrofit sites and collect all the information that you need. And again, we've included that form, a blank copy of that form in your resources list.
Now, this is another common feature of all center products, is to have a form with a strange little acronym at the top, right?
We love the acronyms. We added the word soup that's out there already in the stormwater world. RRI, the Retrofit Reconnaissance Inventory. So basically the idea is to use both the form and the base map to collect that important information that you need to make a call on whether or not you can actually do a retrofit at that site. And while we can't really go into a lot of detail about what you need to look for at every potential location, I will spend a little bit of time on existing ponds here because Deb talked about those this morning. Basically, you're going to start at the potential location of your retrofit. It always kills you to spend time in the contributing drainage area or the investigating upstream and downstream stormwater infrastructure just to find a sanitary sewer line maybe a couple feet below the surface when you were planning to excavate that pond to create additional storage. So always check the potential site of your retrofit first and then move up or downstream to determine whether or not you can conduct a retrofit there. Additional guidance on each of those storage and on-site retrofit locations is provided in the retrofit manual, so you can go back and check those out. Really, without going into a lot of details, I want to give you just what the big picture idea of the RRI is. And that's, again, collecting that information that you need to be able to make the call on whether you can do a retrofit or not, and collect that information you need to produce a pretty basic concept sketch of your retrofit and a little short description of it as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be pretty, and we're going to walk through a quick example of a completed RRI form on these next few slides. And I know it's probably extremely difficult to see there on your screen, but we've included a copy of this completed form in your resources with the webcast. So you can go back and print out those resources and have this form. But basically, there's 7 sections to the RRI form, starting off with some header information and basic information about the watershed, the time and date of your visit, and a record of any pictures that you might have taken. Some room for a site description and proposed retrofit location. What exactly are you looking at there? Then we move in on the bottom of page 1 there, a description of the drainage area and existing stormwater management. This is where you go ahead and investigate your contributing drainage area, make a call on how big it is. You might have to do that through mapping, perhaps back in the office like Dan and the city of Charlottesville did, or for the on-site retrofits, often you can't use maps or GIS data because the resolution is not good enough, so you actually have to walk the site to delineate your drainage areas in that case. But basically a description of what's going on there with both infrastructure and your drainage area. Page 2 of the form then moves into the proposed retrofit. So there's room to describe what your retrofit is, what treatment option it is, and really a couple of checks on the realism of your concept. Some room to do some computations on capture volumes, if you want to treat water quality or do channel protection. You're looking at a target capture volume and an actual available capture volume at your site. So the key is to match that available capture volume with your target. And where you have your target much greater than what you can actually do on site, that's where you run into a little bit of problem. Mm-hmm.
where you might decide that it's really not effective to pursue that.
Exactly, and this is where the idea of a walk-away volume, introducing another term here, but basically before going out into the field, you want to make a call as to, hey, if I can only capture 50% of my target volume, perhaps I don't do the retrofit because it's going to be undersized, we're going to have maintenance problems, and it's not going to be providing the bang for the buck that we're looking for. So that kind of relates to what Dan was saying earlier. Right. I think yours was like 1 inch from the site itself.
That's correct, and if we were collecting off-site runoff, we were going to try and capture at least a 1/4 inch. And there were a couple instances where we got there, we started looking at the site, we had what we thought was going to be a great retrofit. Come to find out, we just didn't really have the volume, the capture volume available, and it just wasn't going to make sense financially to proceed with it, so we looked elsewhere.
Yeah, so that's a really good priority-setting tool there.
That's right.
Set some kind of a goal and then evaluate in that way.
Yeah, I always recommend using that walk-away volume idea to be able to screen sites. So that's one check. The other is your site constraints. And the bottom of that second page goes through utility constraints, land use constraints, ownership constraints. So that's the other check on the realism of your concept. The last part of the form, pages 3 and 4, provide room for your sketch, and I like to use the sketch just to do your proposed conditions, because often it gets a little cluttered if you're trying to draw both existing and proposed conditions, and I like to concentrate just on what the retrofit will ultimately be. So here you see a sketch of a proposed wet pond retrofit, and then page 4 provides room for notes and some initial calls on whether the project makes sense or not down there at the bottom of page 4. As you can see on this next slide, we'll show the base map for the same site that the retrofit form was filled out for. And this is where the base map really comes in handy. And as said, on the retrofit form, I like to use the sketch to just show proposed conditions. This base map, you can show your existing conditions really accurately, and they come in handy when you're delineating on-site drainage areas and making notes of the existing conditions. So the base maps are great for the existing conditions at a retrofit site. Our next slide is going to show a little bit more detail about that concept sketch. But I said, it doesn't have to be pretty, but what it does have to do is convey the basic ideas behind your retrofit. What excavation's needed, how is stormwater going to be conveyed into your practice, what's the outlet structure look like, or is it an infiltration basin? Usually just a plan view is needed. You might also need to sketch a little profile view if you're doing a filter practice and show what media you might use, or if elevations really make a difference at the site. Photographs are also really help you document your proposed retrofit and your existing condition as well. So I know Dan used the retrofit form extensively in the city of Charlottesville, and I think found it pretty useful.
Yeah, I'd say we definitely did. To talk a little bit about that field work that did happen, as I had mentioned before, we had prioritized sites and kind of trimmed down the overall to a subset of 24 for field work, which we evaluated over the course of 3 days. The field teams were led by a center staff person who had done a retrofitting exercising before, had the experience, included other center staff, but also included city staff. We really wanted to tag along and participate for a few reasons. We wanted to learn the process that was happening in order to be able to replicate it on our own in the future. We also wanted to see and kind of gain as much insight into the potential retrofits as possible as they were being diagnosed. And we also wanted to be there to provide any historic or current knowledge about the properties, whether it be ongoing master plans or any programming conflicts that a retrofit might run into. We had detailed field maps, we had the center's RRI form, and we were using the methodology talked about from the center's new manual. And again, to make another tie back to our MS4 program, when we were out there, we were also conscious of addressing a piece of MCM3, illicit discharge detection and elimination, because during the field visits, we very much had our eyes open for any suspicious or illicit discharges that might be coming from the public properties themselves, which I'm happy to say we didn't find, or from private properties. And we actually did find one from a private property, and we were able to address that. A total of 121 potential projects were identified, 74 of those actually being retrofit projects. Concept sketches were drawn in the field for many of those, and you can see the various kinds of practices that were identified on this slide. But in addition to those hard practices, we're also looking for landscape management and stewardship practices, such as opportunities for tree planting or designation of no-mow areas, or areas where we could repair some erosion that was active. We also looked for pollution prevention opportunities, such as dumpster management or material storage, places where street sweeping might help, or a stream cleanup would be in order. Unstable stormwater outfalls were also looked at. They can be a significant source of erosion and sediment deposition if they are not stable. Also, features in our GIS that weren't mapped correctly were identified. So we really took as an opportunity not just to identify hard retrofits, but a whole suite of management practices. And again, that ties back to our MS4 permit, MCM number 6, which is pollution prevention and good housekeeping for municipal operations. If we could tie some of these into ongoing management of our properties, we're going to be getting some water quality improvement there as well.
That's great, Dan. I mean, I think it's important to point out, even though you're out there doing retrofitting, it's important not to keep your eyes closed and just look at retrofitting. Look at everything else that's going on around you as well.
Absolutely.
Certainly, pollution prevention can be very cost-effective, so we should always keep that in mind. And Dan sort of has alluded to this already, but we're going to jump now into compiling an inventory of possible sites here, and that's sort of the step 4 here. And I think, Deb, you were going to talk about how this connects as the next step in the process.
Sure. So, Mike just gone through and explained the process of going out into the field. The step of compiling is just the process of taking the data and the designs you made in the field and compiling those into something that both all the field crews can understand and that you can convey to other people. One of the most important things that you want to do when you compile the retrofits, of course, is to take the designs that seem the most promising and develop them into concept designs. Typically, this would be about a 30% design, which would mean that your sketches are readable to other people, all the information that you need as far as do you have enough head to construct the practice, exactly the details of what the practice is, how stormwater will be conveyed is really easily understood. These will not be construction documents, of course, but it will be something that brings it to that next design level. And then another thing that you're going to want to be able to produce as a part of that is graphics that are able to help other people understand the location and the types of practices that will be proposed as a part of the stormwater retrofit inventory. And Dan, I think what types of graphics did you all produce as part of yours? Was that?
Well, in addition to just the study itself, there was a set of information compiled for each one of the sites that we visited. And that set of information included a summary sheet of all the retrofit possibilities and other observations that were noted there. Also a map which visually depicted where those particular opportunities were. Also, there was quite a bit of analysis done on pollutant removal, and a copy of the RRI form was also in there. And importantly, we also received all of the GIS data. Mike touched on this earlier. This included our subwatersheds, our drainage areas, all the impervious cover digitizing. So we had a database of everything that was identified, and what this will do is we'll use it as a tracking mechanism now and in the future as we are either putting in a retrofit or implementing a management practice. We'll be able to kind of go into GIS and update it and be able to use it to kind of gauge our progress over time.
Another important thing to do, of course, is to just display it visually as a watershed map. It helps you to understand which reaches of stream, which sub-watersheds you're impacting. The next step in the retrofit inventory is ranking your potential retrofits. So you've developed what you think are maybe potential retrofits as a result of your field work. Now you need to do is try to decide which are your best projects. This step 5 is basically how feasible and cost-effective are these practices. And again, I talked about data per square foot of impervious cover treated, for example. just feasibility in terms of what impacts they might have on the neighborhood. An important part of this process of ranking is to consult with the neighborhood. Often it's, again, especially if these retrofits will either directly or indirectly impact somebody's property or even, parks that people use. It's good to, first of all, educate people about, what you're doing, and also try to gather information from people, and real information about, how they feel about the different practices, and also the types of watershed goals that they'll, are interested in. Another part, kind of slightly related to this, is that the retrofit inventory process that Mike was talking about is another great opportunity to interact with people and get ideas about, how they feel about the practices and the resources near them. Dan, if you want to talk about your specific scoring criteria within Charlottesville.
Sure. As you mentioned, once you've identified all these projects, you really need to evaluate and rank them. So we developed a set of screening factors, and it's important to note that they were derived from our initial performance goals. You have to make that link back. After we ran them through, they were weighted. We scored all of the projects, and we only applied this ranking to the stormwater retrofits because they could be directly compared to each other based on pollutant load reduction, cost effectiveness for removing those pollutants, and these other screening factors. We didn't rank the more stewardship activities. That doesn't mean we're not going to do them, but they can be incorporated into ongoing management plans. After they were all ranked, we sat down with the center and we reviewed the ranked projects and discussed ones that we wanted to take to the next level, to the design phase. We discussed how they were ranked. We also discussed some other things, such as we wanted a representation of different types of BMPs. We wanted to make sure parks and schools were represented. We wanted to look at implementation opportunities through master plans and CIP issues. Also things like public safety and permitting and utility conflicts. And just some good common sense and a gut check also plays into this. You can't be completely bound by your ranking process.
And Dan, how did you find the ranking process turned out once you really, sort of scrubbed it?
Well, after we went through and looked at all those things beyond just the hard numbers, we still ended up choosing all ones that were in probably the top quartile of the ranking for what would move forward. So it kind of validated the whole process and the factors that we had chosen and the goals we had looked at. In the end, we ended up with 8 that were selected for design work. So we have this prioritized list, and we'll go back to that and use it as a guide beyond just selecting these first 8. But again, it really is just a list. You still have to have professional judgment, funding opportunities, and kind of broader city goals and initiative are going to play into ones that are implemented in the future.
Okay, and just in the interest of time, Mike, let's run through these last 3 and get to some questions. Greg's or Deb or whoever's going to lead on this one. We've got 3 steps left that we need to cover.
Sure. I'll go through these very quickly. Step 6, it's an important one in terms of just validating or determining how far you got in your original goals. Often your goal might be to reduce runoff volume within a watershed or to, for example, reduce phosphorus load by a certain amount or a certain percentage. What this does is just allows you to go through and just calculate how much you achieved by doing the different practices.
Yeah, and that's very important in keeping with that connection with the water quality goals that we've set up in the first place.
That's right, those measurable goals that we set up first. This is a check on those.
Right.
Right. Step 7 is design and construction. So this would be taking those designs that, you've maybe taken them to a 30% concept design, or you have a conceptual design, and you have your, top few, just bringing those through design and construction. There's still some specific analyses that need to be done, and a lot more detail in the drawings to make those design drawings. It's an important part of this. It doesn't necessarily have to be the people who originally conducted the retrofit inventory, but to have some involvement between the designers and the construction, especially because often in the retrofit situation, there's some kind of tricky types of practices, maybe flow splitters, just unusual practices that get incorporated. So the construction is going to be a very important part of that. Dan, I don't know if you could talk about the details within Charlottesville.
just to touch on quickly some of the projects that were taken to the design for Charlottesville, we had some rainwater harvesting projects, a couple bioretention, bioswale projects, a stormwater wetland was designed. A Piedmont outfall is a term that we came up with in collaboration with the center, and that is a typical design that's meant to be applied and kind of customized to a site where you need an outfall that needs stabilization or repair. It's a step pool treatment cell process. Another one was a typical design for runoff diversion, diverting runoff from an untreated area, such as a roadway, to a bioretention or buffer area. One of the sites where a couple projects were identified was our Charlottesville High School and adjacent Performing Arts Center. A 2,600 square foot biofilter will be put in. It's going to treat runoff from 4 acres, over 1.5 acres of which is impervious surface. Important to note that this site has no current stormwater management at all. In conjunction with that, there's going to be a rather large rainwater harvesting system installed there. It's going to collect runoff from about 22,000 square feet of the Performing Arts Center, and when you start running the numbers there, you can quickly arrive at a very hefty sum of stormwater, over 500,000 gallons that we theoretically can capture, and then the good thing, use right there on site to replace a potable treated water source. So the retrofit projects that we identified in this study really can be seen as an important step in the formation of this retrofit culture in the city. It's hoped that these projects can create a spark that leads to ongoing retrofit activities, not only on public land, but on private land as well. The steps that were taken to design are our highest priority. We have every intention of installing many more of these retrofits in the years to come. And this effort ties into a broader water resources protection program we're pursuing in the study. One of the components of that program will provide funding for these retrofits. This program is also envisioned to be funded mainly through a stormwater utility fee, so there's going to be opportunities to include incentives for private property owners to install retrofits on their own properties as well. We'll also look to incorporate these retrofits into master planning and renovation efforts, try to pull in the private sector, possibly in a fee and lieu program, as Mike talked about earlier in the presentation, which again would tie back to our MS4 permit and MCM5 that Nikos talked about earlier post-construction. So in these ways, we really hope this retrofit culture can firmly take hold, and over time we'll see some real community benefits and some real and meaningful improvements in water quality at the sub-watershed scale as well. Just to kind of wrap things up, a few key points that I'd like to emphasize and leave you all with. In order to realize the best results from your retrofits, consider them strategically and methodically, and tailor them to meet your sub-watershed's particular needs. Having a study like we have is going to be a great tool in years to come for retrofit planning. I would also say use your retrofits as demonstration projects where you can. Inspire and encourage private property owners to install them. And by doing this, what you also do is you increase the local knowledge base of stormwater management in your area, because the more familiar, understood, and tangible these kind of projects are, the more they'll be implemented. This ties in again to involving and educating the public about your projects. The more they're involved, the greater chance for long-term success of these projects, I think is pretty fair to say. And in developed sub-watersheds like Charlottesville, installing retrofits has been identified as a really essential component of a successful watershed restoration and rehabilitation initiative. And we're also looking at this in the overall context of environmental sustainability in the city.
Great. Thank you, Dan. We certainly were very impressed by all the steps that you took to manage stormwater and to deal with retrofits and to really go through this kind of methodical process that we've been describing here. So I think, folks, you can see the URL there is there for the study again, which will be a very useful reference for folks. And I know we're going to extend a little bit for our audience there, so we'll extend a few minutes beyond 2 o'clock, so no panic. But I know we have a lot of questions out there, and you saw that we skipped one of the planned question breaks, so we'll try to take them as many as we can right now. So, John, what do we got there?
Sure. The first question was for Dan, and it's from Jim, who asked, what method did you use to rank the retrofit projects?
Well, there was a suite of screening criteria that was developed, and they were weighted criteria. So we looked at things such as pollutant removal ability, the cost effectiveness of that pollutant removal. Did the retrofits capture runoff from on-site, or was it only, or was it additionally collecting runoff from off-site? Because that was one of the goals, was to try and provide some sub-watershed treatment. We looked at other things such as, did it promote bacteria removal, tying back to TMDL issues we have in the area and some pollutants of concern, as well as maintenance issues, and did it support other city initiatives like our tree canopy initiative? Or are we going to have to chop down a bunch of trees in order to put a retrofit, and kind of striking a balance between lots of different issues that we're looking at in the city?
Okay. Dan, are those criteria elaborated on in the study?
They are. They are.
Great.
And I think the nice thing that the city did was tied those ranking criteria in with those restoration objectives and performance criteria that they set out during the scoping process for their study.
Great. The next question actually is probably either for Mike or Nikos, but Ellen from Boston asks, have any communities implemented stormwater retrofitting program because of requirements in their MS4 permit? Have you run across any MS4 permits that require retrofitting?
Well, again, I guess this gets a little bit to that definitional question. But for me, when we talk about redevelopment of a site, we're also talking about retrofitting it to make it work better. And yes, that is part of the MS4 requirements. Just to clarify in case anybody's confused, this manual is not required. This is guidance in order to help you meet that overall objective of when you do have those redevelopment sites that are an acre or bigger, that those can be dealt with so that they're more stormwater friendly once that redevelopment process is done.
Yeah, Nikos, I think that's the right answer. It's that, remember what our definition of retrofit is, and that's where a stormwater management practice is installed where there weren't any controls, or where those controls didn't do everything we wanted them to do in the first place. So that can be on redevelopment sites which are covered by the MS4 permit.
Right. Now, it's fair to say, too, that there are some communities out there that are requiring some kind of retrofits on existing development. We gave the example, for instance, before about the downspout disconnection programs, and so those would apply to houses and buildings that are already there. That wouldn't be part of the NPDES requirements, but that's something that the community is trying to do on its own.
Okay, next question is Gene from the City of Orange. This question is for Dan again. After a small retrofit study was completed and potential sites were prioritized, has the city set a strategy for funding of the retrofit practices?
Yeah, we certainly have. There's several sources of funding we're looking at. One was an appropriation from our city council to specifically put some of these retrofits in the ground. And again, that ties back to our larger water resources protection program, where we want to demonstrate some of the things that citizens would see. If we end up going with the stormwater utility and fees are collected, we can put some of these projects in the ground and be able to give them an example. These are the kinds of things that your stormwater dollars are going to pay for. In addition to that, we have applied for, trying to use that money as matching funds to leverage additional funding through a grant opportunity to get a few more of these put in the ground in the near future.
Okay. The next question is Thomas from Florida, and I'll open this up to anybody. He asks, when looking at small areas and on private property, what are some of the legal mechanisms used to ensure long-term O&M?
Well, I guess there's a few different options. Occasionally, the practice itself can be dedicated to whomever the municipality is, and that municipality would in effect own it. The other is through a formal maintenance agreement between the property owner and the municipality. Those are the kind of two most common ways done.
I think a lot of the downspout disconnection programs that are out there that have done these individual on-site practices on residential sites have used pretty much like a waiver that the property owner will sign that says, I disconnected my downspout to this practice voluntarily, and I agree to maintain it in a safe condition over time. And they'll have inspection staff that, well, they might not get to every site every year, will go out there to make sure that things are looking good, and they will provide technical support as well to the property owners that might want to reconnect their downspouts or maybe get rid of that rain garden that was put in. So they'll help out along the way, but the simple answer is, through the waiver and maintenance agreement.
Okay. Next question is Ken from California asks, when talking about bang for the buck, cost effectiveness as part of implementation, how do you compare some of the on-site versus storage retrofit opportunities in regards to that cost and scale, in terms of bang for the buck for that?
Typically, the on-site storage practices are cheaper per impervious cover treated, so they're typically numerically more cost effective. But as Nikos pointed out earlier, often to achieve all the objectives you set out, you're going to have to use a combination of those larger practices with the somewhat more expensive on-site practices.
And remember our example that we started off with towards the beginning of the webcast. The more developed your watershed gets, the harder it's going to be to find those large storage practices. So often you have to do those on-site practices, although they may be slightly more expensive. Answer is that you've got to use them anyway to meet your goals.
Right, and contrary to the most common thing that Americans want is the cheapest price for anything, right? In this case, price is one category that we look at in terms of making these decisions, but really, it should be equally balanced with whether we're going to meet the watershed goal that we're trying to achieve in the first place. And so on acre by acre basis, it may be more expensive to do that. But you have to limit your scope to looking at things that are actually going to get you to the water quality goal, and then pick the most cost effective within those. If you just use cost effective, you may end up with something that's not going to get you anywhere.
Right.
And as we talked about before, for instance, if we set a goal of infiltrating 1 inch from a particular area, and that's our goal, we might be able to, achieve a 1/4 inch relatively cheaply, but we still haven't met our water quality goal. So I think we've got to keep that in perspective, that cost effective is just one thing, and it's not the only thing that we look at.
Yeah, never lose sight of that big picture, what we're actually working for.
By the way, in case you're curious, today we have 2,294 people attending this webcast. So congratulations to everybody that signed on and for such a huge audience and bearing with us. We still have a couple more minutes, I think, to take a couple more questions, so let's use our time effectively.
Yeah, we can, I think, take one more question. Nikos put up the next Stormwater webcast on June 4th, and again, we hope you join in with us. Last question we can take is from Richard in Washington State, who mentions that most retrofit actions in their state are tied to redevelopment due to permitting requirements. However, redevelopment activities often don't correspond to the highest retrofit priority areas. Nikos, can you address, is there some flexibility there for maybe taking credit for off-site retrofits and high priority areas that will achieve greater water quality benefits versus these redeveloped projects?
Yeah, I think, again, that going through a methodical process and explaining clearly what it is that you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it really makes the most sense. And, yeah, in some cases you're going to choose one kind of project or one kind of area over another one. And to me that makes a lot of sense in terms of, achieving your overall goals.
I think a specific mechanism, too, for doing that was talked about a little bit earlier is that if you have a redevelopment criterion you need to meet, you can use a fee and lieu structure where you can say if you didn't meet it on this practice, on this project, instead you can contribute to a fee that goes toward the most effective water practices within the watershed.
Yeah, and there are other communities,
right,
in addition to the fee and lieu program, have done things where if you can't meet it on the specific site, that you pay for practice someplace else in the watershed. There's lots of ways of doing that.
And I think that's really where it's key to have some places already diagnosed and planned out and, prioritize so that when those opportunities do come up, you're not scrambling to go out there and find a place. You already have something similar to what the City of Charlottesville has now, which is a catalog of retrofit opportunities that we can chip away at over the years to come.
Great. Well, just wanted to make a note that the participant certificate link is up on your up on your screen. You can also click the certificate button to get an individual certificate printed. If you have multiple, click on that PDF and you can fill in everyone's name. Just like to remind everyone that today's webcast will be archived within a couple of weeks. That will be on EPA's MBDS training website that you use to register for this webcast. Evaluation survey will appear on your screen next. Please consider completing this survey and let us know your thoughts. We do appreciate all your feedback. And also, please turn off your pop-up blocker in order to see that survey. Also, don't forget to download that certificate and complete it. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webcast, and also thank you to Mike, Deb, and Dan for presenting today. Our next Stormwater webcast, as Nikos mentioned, will be June 4th. We'll address MS4 program performance. So go to EPA's MBS training courses and website for more information. That website is www.epa.gov/MPDS/training. Announcement will also be sent out through MPDS News. This ends our webcast for today. Thank you for joining us.